G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Economics Academy once again. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Canberra is Ngunnawal country, and I'd also like to acknowledge that it's NAIDOC week this week. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. If you can, please go to the National Treaties Summit and head there to find out about how you can support the campaign for voice, treaty and truth. And thank you so much for joining us today. This is our penultimate Economics Academy webinar. This week, we'll be talking about when markets work well. But if you've missed some of our other content, you can find that on our website at the link we sent to you in the email, which is /economics_academy_1. All of the content from semester 1 is available there. And if you have to duck out of this webinar for whatever reason, this will be available there too. Some of you had some trouble accessing the video tutorial today because YouTube has been down. I'm not sure whether that's fixed yet, but it shouldn't be more than a day, I wouldn't think, before that's working again. So if you check back soon, I'm sure that'll be up and running. Just a few tips before we begin to help make sure that this runs smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of Richard and Matt, upvote questions from other people and make comments. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And for those people who find the chat distracting, you can click on the chat function and it should pop up as a separate window that you can minimize. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and we will post it up on the website a bit later today. Our two instructors today, as usual, are Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and Matt Grudnoff, Senior Economist at the Australia Institute. And as I mentioned today, we're going to be talking about when markets work well and perfect competition. So Richard, because YouTube is down and not everyone might have been able to access the tutorial that we put up earlier this week, can you just talk to me a little bit about why economics focuses on when markets work well and when do they?
Sure, but before I do, I'm excited to hear this is the penultimate episode because that means that the next one will be the ultimate episode. Economics. So I'm so I look forward to giving the ultimate academy. Look, markets are a powerful force. Markets are one of the ways that societies have invented to coordinate resources, to answer the fundamental economic questions of what to produce, where to produce, how to produce, and who to give it to. Markets are really good at that. Think about in the last 20 years, a whole bunch of people realized that they really can't get through the day without paying someone to make them coffee. We used to not need so much coffee. We used to think we could make it ourselves. Now we know we've got to pay $5 to get someone else to make us that one with the perfect crema. And without a committee being formed, without legislation being passed, without any form of central coordination, hundreds of thousands of people have been employed to work in tens of thousands of cafes across Australia like magic. Markets work really well, sometimes. Like markets really can move a lot of resources into the activities that people want. But they don't always work well. They don't always move resources to what we want. And, economists know this. We're not surprised by this. In fact, we've got models and theories about when we think a market would do a good job and when we know it would do a crap job. And, the shorthand version is when markets are competitive or perfectly competitive, that's when we think that the market is likely to do a pretty good job of moving resources to where we want them.
So Matt, picking up on that then, what is perfect competition?
Well, perfect competition is this great state where it effectively has maximum competition, if you like. And in order to have perfect competition, there are a couple of rules that we need. The first is there needs to be lots of buyers and sellers, And those buyers and sellers can't dominate the market. So we've got lots and lots of really tiny firms all competing against each other for your dollars. The next rule that we need is that there can't be any barriers to entry or exit. So a barrier to entry is basically when a firm can't set up in the market because of some reason. So a barrier to entry might be huge capital startup costs. So if you wanted to set up, Ebony Airlines, you'd need lots and lots of money, and it would be really, really difficult. So that's a big barrier to entry. And so what barriers to entry mean is that a firm can stop other firms entering the market so they can make big profits and they don't have to worry about competition. Another one is we need perfect information. So what needs to happen is instantaneously, everybody knows exactly the price of all goods sold from all firms and exactly what the best option for them is. And so they're also perfectly rational people, and they can do all that calculus immediately and instantly, which means that they can always go to the firm that will give them the best deal. And that includes being able to differentiate between quality. So if you see two items and one of them's $5 and one of them's $4, you know whether the difference in price is based on the fact that the $5 one is a better quality or whether the $5 one is just charging more. So that's perfect information. And the last one is no externalities. And basically that means that there are no sort of additional things that affect other people in the transaction. So a classic example of an externality is climate change. So if we use or produce goods or use goods that create greenhouse gas emissions, that will affect other people and other generations for years to come, but that weren't a part of the transaction, weren't a part of buying whatever good that's being sold. So they're basically the strict rules that will produce, if all those rules are in place, then we will have a perfectly competitive market, and the market will perfectly allocate in the most efficient way resources.
So apart from coffee, Richard, how often do markets work how often is there perfect competition?
Look, I mean, arguably, markets are never perfectly competitive. If you listen carefully to what Matt said, we mean it literally in economics. Zero transaction costs, complete information, complete computational power to look at all of the options. So perfect markets, probably never, but there's lots and lots of markets that get close to it. Coffee being one. Uber's a really interesting example. It's not a textbook definition of perfect competition, but think about the marketplace within Uber. And I'm not talking about Uber the company, I'm talking about the marketplace that Uber's invented. On New Year's Eve, when lots of people want to lift home from somewhere, lots more cars will make themselves instantly available to ferry those people home. And if there's a lot of people that want to lift home and only a few cars, the price will go up. That is, the people who are most willing and most able to pay will get the journey, and someone else will wait longer or miss out. So within the marketplace of Uber, we see new suppliers coming in by the hour. We see new suppliers exiting by the hour. So markets work like a competitive market, the textbook version, quite often. But to take Matt's example of the airline, if Ebony wants to set up Ebony Uber, there's going to be enormous barriers to you competing with Uber. So we get all these complications or ironies to some extent because there's hyper competition within Uber, but try and set up a competition to Uber and you bump into a massive barrier to entry. So, again, we just have to not be too literal about, is the market perfect or is it broken? We need to kind of explore the tools, with the tools economics have, which assumptions hold, which ones don't, and what's my judgment call about the consequences of that.
I think I would make an excellent tech billionaire.
There are no billionaires. There are no billionaires in perfectly functioning markets. Billionaires are a sign that some market somewhere has failed.
Yes, and I should add that when markets fail is our ultimate topic for Economics Academy semester 1. So we'll probably get into tech billionaires in more detail at some point. But if so far we've learned that economics is about efficiently distributing scarce resources, if distribution means that some people win and some people lose out, Matt, who does an economist want to see win out of efficient market distribution?
Yeah, so economists like to pick winners in the sense that they're always batting for the consumer, or the economics field as itself is supposed to be designed to help consumers. That is, a firm in a perfectly competitive market has to work really, really hard, do a really, really good job, and won't make a very big profit doing it. So if we go back to our Uber drivers, they work really hard, but they don't make a great deal of money. And because they're doing that in economics, we hope that what that means is that the price is very low and the consumer is getting it at the minimum price, the smallest price, the best quality, the best service at the lowest price. So it's consumers that we're trying to be the winners in this. And so therefore, yeah, so economics is trying to help the consumer.
And Richard, are markets good at that, at helping consumers to win?
Oh, look, sometimes, and this is there's no doubt that I'm not a fan of the taxi industry. The taxi industry in Australia has huge barriers to entry called a taxi license. And the taxi licenses in New South Wales used to sell for like $500,000. So if someone thought, gee, people are waiting for a long time to get a taxi, I might buy a car and offer myself as a taxi driver. You literally had a barrier to entry that cost $500,000 called, can you get a taxi license? Or, and this is the fascinating bit, the only way to enter the taxi market was to literally pay $500,000 to someone who was already in the market and ask them to leave. So the taxi industry was far, far, far from a competitive market. And there's no doubt that consumers were poorly treated by the monopoly taxi industries in most cities. So then Uber comes along and smashes down these barriers to entry. Now, this again is where all this stuff gets complicated, but I think interesting. Does that make Uber the goodie or the baddie in the story? Well, it doesn't make anyone the goodie or the baddie, right? Because in economics, we assume that people who own taxis want to maximize their profit and they want to grab onto as much cash as they can and they want to create barriers to entry and protect their profit. We actually assume they'll do that. But we also assume that regulators won't encourage or facilitate that. And we assume that technological change will come along and smash down barriers to entry as well. So Uber comes along and smashes down the barriers to the taxi industry. Value of taxi licenses has collapsed. That's good for consumers. It's bad for the people who used to own the taxi license. Is it fair? I don't know. What's your definition of fair?
Economists don't do fair, Richard.
We don't do fair. How many times can we tell people this? But digital cameras came and destroyed photo development labs. Was that fair? Or was it fair that they used to charge me $25 for 24 photos, half of which were my thumb?
God, I remember those days.
Right. So technological change can destroy what look like strong barriers to entry. Regulatory change. Who's allowed to own a bank? What's the definition of a bank? All sorts of regulation.
Casino seems to be a good topic at the moment.
Yes.
Perfect example. So we want to regulate some markets sometimes. We want to rip down some regulations sometimes. And, anyone that's heard me talk before, these are just democratic decisions. And economists can just kind of help us understand the pros and the cons, not the right and the wrongs.
Yeah. I just want to shout out, we've got about 650 people on the webinar today. Thank you all for joining us at today's Economics Academy. I can see someone called Leonie can't get access to the earlier videos. Just to repeat, YouTube has been down today. That's what we think the problem is. We haven't changed any of the settings. They should all be there as soon as YouTube gets back up, and they'll all be freely available to all of you who have registered in perpetuity. So if you can't get onto it today, we apologize. We didn't foresee that YouTube would go down today. A bit of unfortunate timing, but it will be there.
How are people going to watch all those cat videos?
That's right. And I can see people from all across the country, but particularly I can see there's someone joining us from Barkindji country in Wilcannia. I want to shout out to you guys. I know we've done a lot of work around the Murray-Darling Basin and around that area. And we know you guys have been doing it tough there. So thanks for joining us today. Back to perfect competition and when markets are working well, Matt. I mean, what are the other considerations that we have to take into account when using regulation, for example? And is a lack of regulation necessarily a sign that a market is working well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as we said, if you had a perfectly competitive market, then you wouldn't need regulation. Well, maybe. I mean, you'd need the basic stuff like all markets need some regulation. So the enforcement of property rights, for example, requires regulation, requires a law. Enforcing contracts requires a law. But perfect competition would require a minimal amount of regulation. But if you don't have perfect competition, if you have a market that's not perfect competition, which is pretty much every market, then you're going to need some level of regulation. And, that doesn't mean that every market needs, huge amounts of regulation. But if you're talking about monopolies or large oligopolies, which an oligopoly is a few huge firms that use their massive market power to manipulate the price and get bigger profits, then that's a market that definitely needs regulation. But if you had, a market that like cafes, for example, it probably needs a lot less regulation. But again, it still needs some, occupational health and safety, food, health standards, those sort of things. Everybody would presumably want their cafe to have those kind of regulations, but it would require less. So it depends on how far away you are from that perfect competition. Lots of small firms, no barriers to entry, perfect information, no externalities. The closer you are to that, probably the less regulation you need. The further you are from that, the more regulation you're going to need.
Yeah, it's really funny because certainly just thinking of Uber, like the Australia Institute has been quite critical of its role in ushering in the gig economy and kind of this piecemeal work, in very insecure work. Drivers aren't paid very well, all of that kind of thing. But I often get the sense from listening to the media and other economists out there in the media that when companies like Uber come in and start making big profits, that's really great and healthy. So I'm just wondering, when it comes to competition, Richard, do economists mean competition and competitiveness in the same way that a layperson would understand it? So some of Australia's banks, for example, are amazingly profitable. Does that mean they're really competitive?
No, you lay people are wrong and us economists right. No, it's a really important question. The term competitive is really important in economics. Like, we've been talking about a competitive market, and we've just defined competitive market and a perfectly competitive market as a market with lots of buyers, lots of sellers, and no barriers to entry. So in a competitive market, if I'm making $500,000 a year selling coffee, on a corner in Canberra, in a competitive market, no barriers to entry, someone's going to go, oh, I'd like a slice of that. I think I'm going to set up right next door to Richard. And, I wouldn't mind $500,000 a year profit for selling coffee. So in a highly competitive or a perfectly competitive market, profit falls to near zero. Because if there's a profit there, that profit acts as a signal. Basically, it's like, come and get me. Here's a surplus. It costs this much to make something, and I'm selling it for this much. So, if you want a slice of this action, into this market. But of course, when there are barriers to entry, you can sit behind the barriers and make a nice big record profit. So the banks in Australia are literally some of the most profitable banks in the world. Now, that's proof. Like, this always does my head in. People say, oh, our banks must be competitive. They're very profitable. It's like, no, that's the opposite of economics. If you're making a big profit, it's proof that your market isn't competitive. It's proof that there is some barrier to entry, legal, technological, cultural, that is stopping people coming and cutting your lunch. So, you know, in Australia, the land of oligopoly, we are not a competitive economy. It's Coles versus Woolworths. It's Qantas versus Ansett, then Qantas versus Virgin. It's the big four banks. It's Bunnings versus no one. Okay, Australia has got one of the most concentrated retail landscapes in the world, but our public debate has flipped that on its head and said, wow, we've got the most profitable banks in the world. We must be really good at it. We are winning the competition to gouge customers. Check out the profits that Australian banks make. So if I'm the fastest runner in the world, I win the competition every time. I get the gold medal. I'm competitive. I win. But a competitive market is not a competition with a winner. A competitive market is a whole bunch of companies making bugger all money and consumers enjoying choice and low prices. So yeah, language is really confusing around this.
So one other thing that I wanted to pick up on, and I'm sure we'll talk about this next week when we talk about when markets fail in a
the ultimate episode.
But one of the criteria that you mentioned for perfect competition, Matt, was no externalities, if I'm correct.
Yep.
Just take us back through what an externality is and why it's important, why having no externalities is important to fostering perfect competition.
Yeah, it's a good question. So imagine you had a paint factory, Ebony's Paints, and you decided that getting rid of all those nasty paint chemicals in the production process, that was expensive. So instead, to save money, you dumped all of your chemicals in the river, right? And they just washed away. Now, you'd save a lot of money. You'd be able to sell your paint cheaper, and you'd be able to make more paint, right? You'd be able to sell more paint, make more paint, make cheaper. But imagine that, you know, there's a heap of fishermen who work downstream, and all the fish are suddenly toxic or dead. They've been impacted by your decision, your production decision, and, you know, and the advantage of your production decision is kind of basically split between you and your consumers. So they've got all the advantage. They're part of the market transaction. And then there's this third party, these people who use the river further down, whether they're swimmers, fishermen, or people who just like a pristine environment. Suddenly the river's now toxic, or farmers, and they've all been impacted. So we call that an externality. An externality is anybody who's been impacted, positively or negatively. Usually we talk about negative externalities, but that have been impacted by somebody else's market transaction. And so again, climate change is the classic one they usually use, because if we're using a whole heap of coal to generate electricity, we're enjoying the being able to switch our lights on, run our air conditioners, do all those kinds of things. But then other people who aren't a part, who might be generating their electricity without carbon emissions, or future generations are going to be impacted by our decisions in a negative way. And so that's the negative externality.
And to give you another example, Eb, like say you're willing to spend $50 getting a haircut, and you think the haircut's worth $50, and Matt's laughing, I don't know why. So
I love your haircut analogy. You're such a
that, Richard.
Somebody who knows all about haircuts.
I'm an expert, all right? So you think the haircut's worth $50, the hairdresser thinks it's worth $50. That's got nothing to do with me. Like, I don't care. I'm very happy for the consumer and the producer to agree on a price between yourselves. It has no impact on me. But if I live next door to the hairdresser and the hairdresser keeps chucking hairdressing chemicals, into my backyard, then I care about your transaction. So it's why most economists are pretty libertarian, myself included. Like if a buyer's happy and a seller's happy, I'm happy. Like, what do I care? Knock your socks off. But so many markets have negative externalities that even though I'm libertarian about what you want to do with your cash, I'm often on the side of regulation saying, hey, you can't let the producer do that, or the consumer. I mean, if you want to buy a leaf blower and Matt's happy to sell you one, well, what about me? Why do you get the headphones? You should be buying headphones for me so I don't have to listen to your leaf blower. So externalities are really important. and economists tend to be happy to let consumers and producers negotiate between themselves, except when they're imposing costs on someone who's not a part of the transaction.
And just a note there, that's why diversity in these kinds of panels is important. Richard probably doesn't know the price of a women's haircut because he hasn't had a haircut in a while, but we've got a couple of comments there about them telling me he's dreaming that a women's haircut would cost $50. It was just an example.
Yeah.
It does
And
remind me.
Are they more or less?
It does remind me of earlier in the year during the pandemic lockdown at the beginning when Cabinet made the decision that you can only have a 30-minute haircut, which also confounded a lot of women.
Plenty of time, isn't it?
What do you do with the other 25 minutes? Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why we need more women in the cabinet, but certainly not the only reason. But it did make me think also, Richard, what you're talking about there. And again, we might be kind of heading into when markets fail. But I'm thinking now of Perfect Competition and Adani, for example, that's got a deal for free water, some free coal or free of coal royalties, a subsidized train line. I mean, if you're getting all of those things for free and, you know, a bit of a lack of regulation around there, then things aren't working very well in that sense, are they?
Absolutely. So we hear so much about the power of markets and market forces and this thing of free markets. Like, if only we let the market do its thing, everything will be okay. Well, no economist said that ever, anywhere. All right, it's not economics. The idea that if you just let markets do things, everything will be all right is a parody of economics, right? We've got this really simple thought experiment called perfect competition. Professional economists know its limitations, and it helps us understand when markets work and when they don't. Now, with something like a mine, there's all sorts of potential externalities that come with mining, in particular because there's so much disruption to the physical landscape. So you can harm habitat, you can harm species, you can harm cultural priceless, cultural heritage in the case of Rio Tinto. So there's, mining is always going to be, a high risk activity for thinking the market will fix it. And of course, in Australia, it's far worse than that, because in addition to the negative externalities for the Adani mine, for example, the destruction of the habitat for the black-throated finch, in addition to those kind of externalities, and in addition to the climate change externalities that come with burning the coal, and in addition to the impact on Indigenous heritage, in addition to all that, we're actually giving the mine free water. We're giving the mine free access to energy infrastructure. And indeed, we're giving the mine, we were going to give them free coal, a royalty holiday. Now we're going to give them sort of interest subsidies for the non-payment of their royalties. So in order to get the mine up and running, we're actually not only ignoring the negative externalities, we're chucking subsidies at it. Now, the analogy I use, to help you get your head around that, sorry, my washing machine's just finished. Imagine I said, look, I want to set up a beautiful hotel up in far north Queensland, remote, perfect, oh, wonderful. People are going to come from all around the world. I just need the government to build me an airport and a road to get there, and water supply and energy supply. And, if they wouldn't mind lending me some money at low interest rates, I could really make a go of this thing. Like, well, of course you could. But the fact that you can't cover the costs of all those things is, from an economist's point of view, proof it's a bad idea, right? If you don't want to risk your money to pay for all the costs to get your project up, then it's probably a bad project, and that's a alleged lefty economist here saying, no, markets give powerful discipline to decision making, and we need to think seriously about why we would subsidize some activities, especially ones with negative externalities.
You're muted, Ebony.
Sorry, I've got a cough, so I muted myself when I coughed, but
You're muted. It's the phrase of 2020, isn't it?
it certainly is. So that brings me, I think, to maybe one of the best questions that we've ever had on Economics Academy, or probably any of our webinars discussing economics this year. It's from Marie Menidis, and it's, why does economic theory use a prescriptive model, i.e. the way a perfect market would work, rather than a descriptive model, i.e. the way they actually work? Do you want to take it, Richard?
Yeah, sure. So economics doesn't. Like, let me just be all defensive of economics here for a second. If you study physics in high school, and, you know, it's more than 30 years since I did, but back when I did, you know, we teach people this really simplistic version of Newtonian physics. All right, if you fire a cannonball at 10 meters per second at 45 degrees, how far will the cannonball fly? All right, and we teach this. We say this is physics. All right, and someone says, what about air friction? And your teacher says, well, because it's a ball and it's heavy, you don't have to worry much about air friction. But what you just heard the teacher say was, I'm teaching you a simple model. Keep your complications to yourself there, son. All right. So all theoretical models are simplifications of reality. Their usefulness is sort of what's important. Now, if I wanted, you know, if I was in class, I'd be chucking a pen at Matt or Ebony right now, showing how a simple predictive model using Newtonian physics is really quite accurate. But if I hold a piece of paper in my hand and try and throw it to Ebony, who knows where it will land? Simple Newtonian physics is really good for cannonballs, and it's pretty good for pens, and it's absolutely crap for bits of paper. So it's not the model of Newtonian physics that's crap. It's using a model of Newtonian physics for a problem that is clearly not appropriate for. So economists' model of perfect competition isn't evil. And I don't actually think most trained economists run around pretending that's how the world works. But what happens is, one of the conclusions of that model, just leave it to the market. Market forces are good. If we leave things to the market, the outcome will be efficient. We've taken the conclusion of perfect competition and pretended it's some sort of generalizable conclusion for markets more generally. But that's not economics. It might be some well-paid economists being paid to pretend it is. It's more likely a politician or a business person sort of abusing the theory that Matt and I are here talking to you about. But yeah, perfect competition isn't prescriptive. Most trained economists, I'd say 99%, wouldn't actually stand there and try and tell you, this is a good idea, we should just let the market rip. There's a few out there, kind of ultra-libertarians, but you know, they're not actually, I don't think, got very good economics behind their very strong views about hating the state. So it is a very good question. I hope I didn't sound too defensive of economics in answering it, but the perfect competition model helps us understand what happens to the price of prawns at Christmas time. They go through the roof. It helps us understand what happens with the supply of Uber drivers at midnight. You know, and it's a really useful model, sometimes. But for designing a health system, for designing an energy system, for designing an education system, for designing a telecommunications system, it's crap. It's virtually meaningless. But that's not the model's fault, I would suggest.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the other thing is most people hear, when they hear people talking about economics, it's actually from people who aren't economists. Most of the people that talk about, you know, well, economic, this is important, markets are important, all those kind of things, most of them aren't economists. In fact, a while back, I went back and looked to find out how often treasurers in Australia are economists. So Treasury, you know, the Treasurer is the head of the Department of the Treasury. It's full of economists. They're about, you know, managing the economy. You have to go back to Whitlam in the early 70s to find the last time that Australia had a treasurer who was an economist. Most politicians are not economists. And most of the people you see talking on TV about economics or listen to on the radio, they're not economists either. So you got to remember that economics is used by a lot of different people, often to push a political agenda or to push their own ideology, and they're sort of pretending that this is how economics works, when in reality, that's not what economics says at all.
So I think that leads quite nicely into the next two questions here from Julian McCoy and Leon Leontiev, which I think are linked. So Julian asks, if perfect markets are basically mythological, how did Hayek and Friedman and their neoliberal ilk convince governments the world over that market regulation is bad? And the other one is, what is the rationale for free markets? On what basis do economists believe that markets function better without regulation?
Well, first and foremost, language really matters. And I just saw one of the comments pop up before about how the word perfect doesn't help. Well, yeah, exactly. So we, by calling them perfect markets or perfect competition, there's no doubt that sounds like we're attaching some sort of moral preference to it. And you're right, language matters, but the language being used between consenting adults, in the economics discipline is problematic, as it is in all disciplines. But more than any other discipline, I'd suggest our language is pumped out in ways that have all sorts of confusing consequences. So language really matters, and economists have not helped reduce confusion. Indeed, I wrote Econobabble, a book all about this, precisely because I think we deliberately use plain English words in very technical ways, and then we complain that other people are misinterpreting us. We take plain English words, distort them, and pump them like a virus back out there into society, and then we blame the people we infect. How did people like Hayek get away with this nonsense? Well, there's a seminar in itself, but let's be clear, you can have too much regulation. You can. And certainly in the 1970s in Australia, there were all sorts of regulation, for example, of our banking system, that had all sorts of terrible consequences, including, for example, single women could not get a mortgage in Australia in the 1970s or 80s. So there's no doubt that, a lot of what Hayek was raging against, well, some of his gripes were legitimate, but the genius of that kind of neoliberal agenda was that they found a couple of, really sort of problematic things and said, here's an example of a dumb regulation. The trick was to say, therefore all regulation is dumb, and that wasn't economics. That was rhetoric. That was persuasion through language, persuasion through argument, not solid economic theory. So yeah, how did they get away with it? Because they were really smart and they worked really hard, and they weren't stupid. They won. They've influenced the world for 40 or 50 years, and we're still yet to find a language or a political base that can flip it on its head.
The next question here is from Kathleen Davies. She asks about consumer sovereignty from the tutorial. If consumer demand is supposed to determine what is produced, then why is there so much push from marketing onto consumers to manipulate moods, psyches, and buying behavior? Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. So in perfect competition, we talked about perfect information. There's a lot of perfects, isn't there? And if you've got perfect information, then advertising is utterly and totally useless. In fact, it's worse than useless. It costs your firm money, and all of your consumers automatically know exactly what they want and where the best place to get it. So it's entirely useless. And so what we know from advertising is great. Richard and I particularly love advertising because it tells you what actually happens in the real world, because that's where firms are willing to put their money, as opposed to what happens in the theoretical world. But the fact that advertising is successful shows that people aren't rational, they don't have perfect information, and they can be manipulated. And that's exactly what an advertiser's job is. And firms are willing to pay good money to get advertising, And that basically shows that we're not in a perfectly competitive market, and that's persuasive. And the other great thing about advertising is advertising is not informative. You rarely have ads. There are some, but you rarely have ads that talk about the price of something. Now, in economics, we're obsessed with the price of things, right? It's like the number one thing, right? What is the price? That determines demand. You might remember from an earlier episode, we talked about demand, and that determines how much you're going to sell. There are very few ads that talk about the price. They're all about attractive people enjoying themselves. And the product is somewhere placed in that,
I've always thought that
tells us. And I would love to do, perhaps next year, if we do this Economics Academy again, I'd love to do some stuff on behavioral economics, because it's a fantastic branch of economics. It basically tells us how irrational people are. And again, I'm using the word irrational and rational in the economics terms. As Richard said, we've kind of co-opted the language, but it shows that people can be manipulated. It shows that people make decisions from their emotions rather than just this logical calculus in their brain. So advertising is a great sign that perfect competition doesn't exist in any particular market, but in that market where advertising is actually happening.
And the ultimate example of this, and so one of the assumptions of perfect competition is that consumers are rational, and our definition, and economists' definition of rational is you look at all the products available and you would always choose, if there's two identical products, you'd always buy the cheap one, right? That is the definition of rational according to economics. Now, I know that everyone watching this is rational, but I also know that everyone else watching isn't, okay? Because what we see in Australia, for example, is the big four banks, between them spend around $1 billion a year on advertising. Now, no one knows what $1 billion is, but to give you a sense, that's about as much money as we spend on the entirety of the Australian broadcaster. Okay, the budget of the ABC and the big four banks' advertising budgets are about the same size. So if you think of all of the effort that goes into collecting and reporting news and drama and kids' entertainment, all of the effort that goes into that to inform our society, the big four banks alone spend that much confusing society, absolutely flat out lying to society by saying things like, I've got the cheapest loan of the big four. Well, guess what? The big four are dearer than all the other little banks that can't afford to advertise. Now, I know no one watching this banks with the big four. I know that. Not one of you. And the one that does, I know the first thing you're going to do at the end of this is switch away from them, because Richard's just persuaded you with compelling logic that you are paying too much for an identical
Logic
product.
always works with persuasion.
Logic always works, doesn't it?
Rational.
All the time.
Always rational.
So in perfect competition, the big four banks would be charging exactly the same home loan rate as the smallest credit union that's desperate for your business. Because if the big four banks tried to charge 0.1% more than the smallest credit union, all of their customers would walk. So why would I donate money to the big four banks who I say I hate? But the whole business model of the big four banks is that everyone watching here won't switch after I persuade you. By the way, I'm now using reverse psychology on you. I'm now telling you you won't do it in the hope that that will make you do it. But I suspect I won't. So was that triple reverse? I don't know. But the whole banking system is based on the fact that people aren't rational. And it's the most profitable banking system in the world.
The next question is from Fred Sim, who says, reflecting on sectors like social services, aged care, all the rest of it, in the context of perfect markets, most of the service providers make no profit and often compete to provide services with very tight funding. And while there are barriers to entry, does it fit the conditions of a perfect market that said services aren't necessarily up to expectation and many are just getting by? What's the best approach there?
Allow me to change tone. This is a terribly important question. It makes me really sad, and there is no right answer here. I remember 15 years ago talking to a small community-run legal advice centre who'd been living off the smell of an oily rag for years with government grants that weren't nearly enough to cover all of their costs. So everyone that worked there, didn't get paid enough. The photocopier didn't work. We all know what that place looks like. Anyway, they were beside themselves on hearing that the government was going to stop giving them a grant and go to some sort of tender process, effectively privatise it into an open competitive tender. And typical Richard said, well, what are you worried about? And they said, well, we do all this work and we're going to lose the tender. And I said, no one's going to bid lower than you're willing to do it for. Like, I mean this, look around, right? You guys are effectively charitably subsidising this in the way that the federal government wants to subsidise Adani. Your willingness to work 5 days a week and only get paid for 3, your willingness to basically undercharge, no one's going to compete with you for this. So it's a terrible, terrible thing when people are motivated by concern, when they're motivated by care, when they're motivated by love, we use that against them. Like, let's be clear, we use that against them. And when the big 4 law firms are bidding for work for government, there's no love there and they get paid a fortune. So, yeah, it's terrible when small advocacy groups are pitted against each other to bid the price down. And to be clear, there's nothing perfectly competitive about that market, because remember, perfect competition has lots of buyers and lots of sellers. So when you've got lots of NGOs and one government, that's not perfect competition. That's the hungry mile. That's someone with power playing a whole bunch of people off against each other, and that we use the language of economics and efficiency to justify that. But again, that's an abuse of economics. It's an absolute abuse of economics, because you've effectively got a monopsonist, right? You've got one seller and lots of buyers, and that's a market power situation where market forces, so to speak, won't work.
That brings me to the next question, which is from Graham Lacey. He says, so no one wants a perfect economy then, since there would be very little profit. Matt,
Yeah.
is that right?
Yeah, look, that's a great point. Like, who'd want to be a perfectly competitive, a firm in a perfectly competitive market? They're suckers. They work all day long, super hard, and if they ever get ahead, the extra profit that they make is a signal for all of their competitors to rush into the market and cut their profit away. Look, in perfect competition, we're talking about a situation that's the best thing for consumers. But in the same way, it's worse for firms. And it's not just perfect competition. We sometimes forget, but firms don't like competition, all right? Firms work really, really hard often to try and limit competition, to try and compete in non-price ways that won't affect their bottom line, to try and prevent new firms entering the market, to try and buy up their competitors. So competition is about consumers winning. It's not about firms getting ahead at all. And if there were perfectly competitive markets, firms would be the ones that were losing out. If we go back right to the beginning when we talked about Uber drivers, if you think about Uber drivers, right, you're never become a millionaire or a billionaire driving for Uber, right? You're like the small firm. You're working really hard and you're just keeping ahead to make a profit, but you're never going to get rich doing it. And that's exactly right. Firms will never get rich in a perfectly competitive market. That said, they will compete hard, they will sell at a low price, and consumers will have a lot of choice at a low price. And that's what economics is ultimately focused on.
Richard, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Look, I agree, but, and the brutal reality is if there's 5 cafes in town and they're all struggling, the economically efficient thing is for one of them to go broke. That's actually not a terrible outcome, all right? Because if 4 cafes can serve the needs of the customers, then all of the resources going into the 5th one can be used for some other purpose. How do we decide which of the five should go? Well, in economics, we say the one that can't hang on long enough. And that's all pretty brutal, right? There's nothing nice about this. There's nothing fair about this. But flip that on its head, do we keep every business going because we like the people who run it? No, I'd probably rather give money to the unemployed, or I'd spend more money on teachers and nurses before I would say to every business, oh, you tried your darndest, let me keep you up. So, of course, in reality, in democracy, we come up with some combination of these things. But the flip side of profits are the things that attract more resources to an industry. The flip side of that is that losses are the signal that you should get out of the market. And it's not get out because we hate you, it's get out because clearly the price that people are willing to pay is lower than the cost of all the resources to provide it. And as a society, as a community, as an economy, that's not good in the long run. But in the short run, the disruption for individuals, employees, even consumers, it's a very painful thing. So yeah, we can't be too flippant about this, but the market forces are incredibly destructive. You know, and economists call it creative destruction. New things like smartphones come along and they just destroy the photo development labs. New things like GPS come along and they destroy the people that used to make maps and sell Gregory's. And these sound idiosyncratic, but this is happening all day. This is happening every day. Changes in technology, changes in culture, changes in relative prices of commodities just destroy businesses all the time. It is a tough game. And if you like markets, that's what you like, you know. And if, like me, you maybe think, oh, it's okay, we can afford to be nice, then it doesn't mean you prop up every business forever, but you're probably kinder to the unemployed when that happens, rather than just see them as a freed up resource to go work somewhere else.
The next question is from Linda Tolberg, but I will just say we've had several questions around billionaires being a sign of market failure, and I've just dismissed them all this week, and we'll address those when we get to our ultimate Economics Academy episode in 2 weeks' time on when markets fail. I feel like that's probably a more appropriate place. So thanks everyone for those questions, and we'll make sure we answer that in 2 weeks' time. Linda Tolberg asks, traditional theory argues that consumers respond rationally when they do have perfect market information, but increasingly, especially in the wake of the GFC, that has been questioned, and we have behavioral economics to the fore. And so what is the right way to think about how consumers behave in markets? So I guess that touches on a couple of things that we've talked about today. Matt, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, look, consumers aren't rational in the economic sense at all. Sometimes they are. Sometimes, you know, when they're looking for petrol, for example, they'll be looking, you know, to the point, you know, if it's 0.2 cents further down the road, they'll go down and they'll get that slightly cheaper petrol. But for a whole heap of items, consumers just simply aren't rational. And some of that irrationality is that they don't have all the information. There are whole markets whose model is to try and confuse consumers into buying the product and being able to charge a higher price. So if you want to go out and compare energy contracts or internet contracts or mobile phone contracts, you'll often find that they're incredibly complicated, and it's really hard to compare one contract with the other. That's not a coincidence. That's a design feature of the industry. So some of the times consumers behave irrationally is simply because they don't have all the information. Quality is another great thing. Most people think that if it costs more, then it must be of a higher quality. You know, so all you have to do is put your price up. And in fact, sometimes when firms are setting out in a market, they're new and they're not succeeding, and they go and hire a marketing guru, the marketing guru will actually tell them, put your price up and you'll sell more, because people think, oh, it was too low, it must be of crap quality, I won't buy it. They put their price up and they suddenly sell more. So some of the irrationality is around them not having all the information, but a lot of the irrationality is we just actually make decisions using emotions, not always just logic. And we're fundamentally an emotional species. And sometimes we make those decisions about what we think the product will make us feel, rather than what its utility, to use the economic term, how much utility it will give us. It's, well, will it make me feel good? Does this product say what I think I'm trying to project to the rest of the world, or things like that? And if you look at marketing, as I said earlier, that's what they play on. So humans aren't particularly rational species a lot of the time. And because an economy is just a whole heap of humans making decisions all the time, then we know that all that irrationality goes into all of those decisions, and it goes into the outcomes of the economy.
And again, let's use banking as an example, because it's just so profitable in Australia. So when we say people are rational, what we're really saying is they look at all the costs and all the benefits of all the decisions, and they make a good decision. But remember, we assume things like perfect information and zero transaction costs. So when we say that you're rational and you collect all the information about costs and benefits, if it's time consuming to collect information, you might tell yourself, look, it's not worth spending 5 hours to save myself $50. Now, that doesn't make you irrational. Remember, in economics, we said, but you start with perfect information. So if everyone's got perfect information, it'll never take you 5 hours. So, we're not saying that price is all that matters. And yes, it's just not worth searching for a $5 saving for 5 hours, perhaps. But, and let's use language again, we talk about rational consumers. What humans are really good at doing, and I'm using psychological language now, not economic language, humans are really good at rationalizing whatever they actually did. Okay? Go ask people why they had a fight, with their brother-in-law at Christmas. And the story they tell you is unrelated to what everybody else saw. Okay? Because humans, after they've done something, are really good at storytelling for why they did it. This is not economics, and I'm not a psychologist, but I read a lot about stuff. So here's the point. Anyone watching this who's ignoring my plea to go and switch banks is telling me and themselves that they're too busy. Well, if you've got a $500,000 a year mortgage and you're paying 0.5% too much, that's $2,500 a year. It's $50 a week, tax-free. It's the biggest pay rise, the easiest pay rise you'll ever get if you could be asked spending half an hour online. Now, if you can't be asked doing it, fine, I get it, I understand. But don't tell me you hate the banks. Don't tell me you hate them when you're donating $50 a week to them. Donate that to the Australia Institute, all right? Do me a favour. Do Matt a favour, all right? Do research and economics a favour. But yeah, so because people can't be asked doing it, fair enough. They come up with a story that they're too busy. Okay. They tell themselves the savings aren't that great. Okay. That's rationalizing it. But I'm doing the perfect information for you. I'm telling you what the likely savings are. I'm telling you how much time it will take. And if your half an hour isn't worth $2,500 a year for the next 20 years, wow. Don't say you're poor, and don't say you hate the big banks ever again.
I've got a question here from Fatini, who asks, or who says, your discussion has confirmed my view that we need to get rid of capitalism. What equation is required to overthrow capitalism? That seems like a bit too big of a question to get into today, but we might circle back to that one at some point, Fatini. But Richard, just in the last minute, someone has just asked, could you speak to us of medical services and competition, given that we're in a global pandemic? Just
yeah. And look, we'll talk about that in the ultimate episode, because no one wants to ration access to healthcare the way we ration access to an Uber on New Year's Eve. No one wants to ration pharmaceuticals or an emergency ward in the way that we ration prawns at Christmas time. So most countries, most developed countries, have very, very highly regulated and publicly provided health services for the simple reason that no one wants the distributional outcomes that a free market in access to medical care would provide. And if you watch Mike Moore's Sicko on the American health industry, where a guy who chops 2 fingers off with a saw and he's told the price of sewing each of them back on, one was 50 grand and one was 15, he opted for the cheap one. No one in Australia will ever ask you that question, but that is exactly the question that a market will ask you.
Well, we might have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. As I said, there was about 650 of you with us today. We really appreciate you supporting Economics Academy. We do have 1 tutorial and 1 webinar left. Those will be covering when markets fail. And as I said, hopefully we'll get to all those questions about billionaires being a sign of market failure. But we will have to wrap it up there. Don't forget, if you miss anything, it will be up on the homepage. I'm told that YouTube is back up and working again. And don't forget to make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And in this week's episode, we'll be talking about the climate and foreign policy implications of the US election. And remember, stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing those hands, wear a mask if you can, and stay safe out there, everyone. Thanks very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Thanks, Eb.